God does not kill. I know that statement makes very many people uncomfortable, especially Christians. Immediately, our mind runs to the Old Testament and we start thinking about the flood, the firstborns of Egypt, the earth opening up and swallowing Korah, Sodom and Gomorrah. And most of you will point to those events to discredit the truth that God does not kill. And some of you will even ask me, Ian, are you saying the Bible is lying? Are you saying the Bible is wrong? No, I'm not saying that. I am saying most of us are reading the Bible without the key. You are reading the Old Testament as a flat historical book instead of reading it as a progressive unveiling that leads to Jesus Christ. Because at the end of the day, the Old Testament was speaking concerning Jesus. It was supposed to point you to Jesus Christ. Here's the radical truth for day 31. Jesus Christ is the only perfect theology. Take that or leave it. If you want to know God's nature, if you want to know God's character, if you want to know God's will, you don't look at a plague in Egypt. You look at the life of Jesus here on earth, his death, his burial, and his resurrection. And when I look at Jesus, instead of seeing a God who kills, I see a God who dies for his enemies and those who hate him. So the question is, so why did the Old Testament writers say that God killed? To understand that, we have to go back in time and jump into the cultural context of Israel. Israel did not live in a vacuum. They were immersed in the culture of the ancient Near East. The mindset and the thinking of an Israelite would be more familiar and more similar with that of an Egyptian and a Babylonian and a Mesopotamian than it would be similar to yours. Your 21st century mindset, your cognitive environment, as the scholars call it, cannot be similar or even familiar to you than it was to the Babylonian. And that is why you will find when you study, some people say that there are some accounts and stories that they find in the texts of the Babylonians that they later find in the Bible. Bearing in mind that those texts of the Babylonians and the Egyptians were written before the text of Israel. And so they make the wrong conclusion that the writers of the Bible were only copying stories of the Babylonians and the Egyptians, which is actually wrong. What that proves is the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Israelites had the same cognitive environment. They viewed the world the same way. And for example, a major event like the flood is recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the Babylonian Bible, for lack of a better word, in almost a similar way like the account in Genesis. It does not mean that Moses copied the Epic of Gilgamesh. No. It just means that this was a major event that was covered by different people, different religions, different views, but all of them in the same cultural setting. All of them have a similar cognitive environment. They have a similar cultural context. So let me give you specific reasons, specific cognitive environments, specific mindsets that explains why the writers of the Old Testament would write God is a killer or would present God as a killer. Number one, in the ancient Near East culture, there was nothing like natural causes. There was nothing like a weather pattern. There was nothing like a virus or a bacteria. If a plague killed thousands, they had no category for that. And so what they used to say is that God sent it or a God sent it. They attributed every death that was not a murder as a direct act of God. They blamed God for nature because they didn't understand nature. There was nothing like natural causes. Number two, it's called the Retribution Principle. We see this kind of reasoning in the book of Job. They believed that the universe was in a strict contract. If somebody is suffering, it is because they must have sinned. If somebody died, it is because they must have done something wrong. If somebody is poor, it's because they have sinned. There was no concept of innocent suffering. So when a historian or a writer saw a nation falling in war, he didn't write that they had a weak army. He would write, they sinned and God killed them. Simple. They viewed history through the lens of crime and punishment. And you see that at play majorly in the book of Job. His friends were convinced that the reason Job was suffering, the reason his children died, the reason he lost everything was because he had sinned. And we all know Job was an innocent sufferer. But because that concept did not exist in that cultural setting, in that cognitive environment, his friends continued to insist his suffering, the death of his children, the loss of property, and the sickness was because he had sinned. Yet Job knew that he was innocent. Number three, there's a concept called the great symbiosis. The ancient world believed gods were like mob bosses. They needed food in form of sacrifices, and they needed housing in form of temples. If you stopped paying tribute, if you stopped feeding them, the mob boss would attack you. Israel often projected this transactional pettiness onto Yahweh. They feared that if they didn't bleed a lamb, Yahweh would bleed them. And so, you find somewhere in Jeremiah, God telling them, your sacrifices and offerings I desired not. It's also repeated in Hebrews. So you wonder, but didn't Moses tell them to give the sacrifices? Why is God speaking through Jeremiah saying that their sacrifices and offerings he desired not? Because God is not a transactional God. He never was. When you see him making the covenant with Abraham, he put Abraham to sleep because he did not want his covenant to be between him and man. He wanted his covenant to be between him and him. And so God promises Abraham that if he breaks the covenant, he should suffer. And Abraham also, if Abraham breaks the covenant, it is God again who should suffer, not Abraham, because God is not a transactional God. We see it play out on the cross. In what way? Instead of Jesus attacking sinners, instead of Jesus attacking those who hated him, instead of Jesus attacking those who broke the covenant, he took their sin and he died for them. Because God is not a transactional God. But that is what the ancient Near East culture believed. They believed a God must be transactional. And so Israel started giving sacrifices, not because God asked for them, but because it was what their cognitive environment and their cultural setting was demanding. Number 4, there was also the concept of order through violence. Now, to an ancient mind in the Israelite world and the Babylonian world and the Egyptian world, a good God, a strong God, was a warrior God who killed his enemies and monsters like chaos. You'll see it in the Bible, in order to keep the world safe. If a God was not violent, he was considered a weak God. And so Israel, because Israel lives in the same cultural setting, they never wanted to present their God as weak. And so often they used violent language to describe God's glory. Okay? So wherever there was violence, they would say God's glory. Okay? They were describing God's power the only way their culture knew how. But Jesus comes and shows us what God's glory looks like. And that was the most confusing thing to the Israelite mind, to the ancient mind, that a God would choose to suffer and die to actually show his strength. And so, for centuries, God allowed them to write from their limited perspective. Hebrews 1:1 says that God spoke in various ways and in fragments of revelation, not the full revelation. But in verse 2, he says, he has now spoken. He has now spoken through his Son. So Jesus has the final say when it comes to what God has spoken. Jesus has the final say concerning the nature of God. Jesus has the final say concerning the character of God, the will of God, the working of God. Jesus is the one who has the final say, not your Old Testament Bible. Because when Jesus arrived in the scene, he does something very radical. He steps out of that cultural setting. He goes counterculture. He reveals that God is everything that culture thought he was not. The culture dictated that sinners should die. Jesus said that I did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. The culture dictated that tragedy happens because one has sinned. Jesus spoke concerning the blind man that neither this man nor his parents sinned. So Jesus broke the retribution principle. If you sin, you die. The reason you are suffering is because you sinned. The culture dictated that God hates enemies. Jesus said, love your enemies so that you can be like your Father in heaven, who causes the sun to rise for the righteous and the unrighteous, for the good and for the evil. And so Jesus revealed to us that God actually loves his enemies. And that is why he will command you to love your enemies. Jesus is the specific, exact, high definition image of God. If the Old Testament is a shadow, Jesus is the body. Jesus is the substance. You don't judge the body by the shadow. You judge the shadow by the body. You use Jesus to judge the Old Testament. You use Jesus to interpret the Old Testament, not using the Old Testament to interpret Jesus, because the Old Testament is the shadow and Jesus is the substance.